Goldstein. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And as the member for Goldstein, every time we mention the word Goldstein, we're honouring the legacy of the suffragette Vida Goldstein. And that's the basis which I always correct members, because when you think about Australian political history, you have a limited number of Australian political figures who are honoured by the name of electorates, and one of that includes one of Australia's greatest suffragettes. Apart from when I was doing research for my first speech, where I found an article where she specifically explained how to pronounce her name, and in both of the books that have been published in recent years, Ye Daughters of Freedom and Vida, where it was explicitly explained how to pronounce her name correctly, it's important to get right. Deputy Speaker, Australians simply want to make sure we have stewardship of our natural environment. They want a sense of protection and balance to conserve the environment for future generations, while, of course, building the jobs and economic opportunity for Australians to be able to go on and live successful lives. We are blessed with bounty, we are blessed with opportunity, and it's our responsibility to harness that in a way that continues to grow out the economic potential for our nation and for all. And, of course, to do so requires having a sense of balance in our laws so that we seek to do it in a way that is measured and proportionate, that protects our environment, powers our country and propels us forward to be part of contributing to a global economy, and, of course, to provide the affluence and improvement in standards of living that Australians reasonably expect to enjoy. Because lessons of history, Deputy Speaker, show there is nothing that will corrode the health and well-being of the environment more than when people live declining standards of living. And when they do, particularly in situations of poverty, they turn to the environment as the point at which they try to improve them. Stewardship is understanding that prosperity, environmental conservation, can be a point of opposition, or they can be intrinsically linked. And good nations design laws that intrinsically link the potential of economic opportunity with stewardship, so we're able to hand down to future generations a better environment than we inherited ourselves. But there is one problem with our current environmental framework, or multiple, in fact, Deputy Speaker. The current laws are slow, they're cumbersome and they're expensive. And when I mean they're expensive, they're not expensive because they cost businesses money. Businesses obviously have an obligation to spend the money necessary to preserve and protect our environment. They're slow and expensive because they actually delay the potential for investment in our environment to be able to harness its bounty and its potential. And it's not just in dollars, but it's also in time. It can take decades for mining projects that we desperately need to start develop now. It can take years for them to come onto the table. We have duplicative, overly cumbersome regulation, which often replicates activities between state and federal governments for largely little benefit. And, of course, it's slow and there's huge costs involved, and what we end up having is a huge deadweight loss to our economy. It makes us less competitive on a global market, and we all pay the price through declined living standards because we're not getting the investment capital we need in an efficient way to grow the future of our economy. So there are plenty of reasons to reform the EPBC Act. That's not in question. We just want it to be done in a balanced and measured way. But one of the problems we've got right now is that the government is seeking to ram through legislation and bully the parliament into compliance. I've said so many times before, the Prime Minister has come back from his visits overseas and wants to treat this parliament like it is the National People's Congress, where anybody dare ask questions. In fact, he shut down Question Time when I got up to ask a question in Question Time today, perhaps legitimately because it asked some very difficult and uncomfortable truths into the dark heart of this Labor government. But we'll leave that to another side. There's a reality that we have critical minerals projects which are desperately needed to get up, which could now be 15, 20 years off into the future simply because this government hasn't got the legislative framework right. The same is true with lots of other mining projects which we use to be able to grow the bounty and wealth of our nation so that we can then go on and afford things like our health system, our education system, or, of course, for Australians to be able to do things like get jobs so that they can go on and afford to buy their own home and then go, of course, on and save for their retirement. So it's enormously important. In addition to that, we have environmental laws which are weaponised by those people who have no interest in advancing environmental causes. They seek to corrode and attack economic progress. And I'm reminded, Deputy Speaker, of the example recently of the Environmental Defender's Office. Now, you may recall, Deputy Speaker, that in the other place, in the Senate, there's recently been an inquiry looking at different components of climate misinformation and disinformation. Now, we can debate the relative merits of that inquiry, but I seek not to indulge in that in the context of this legislation. But it never ceases to amaze me that when the Greens call for an inquiry into climate misinformation and disinformation, that the most obvious example that we have had in this nation's history, and the EPBC Act has been an enabler of this, it has been the Environmental Defender's Office taking Santos to court and then literally making up Indigenous traditions that didn't exist, that even local Indigenous people acknowledged didn't exist, as a basis to weaponise to shut down gas projects. This is extraordinary, Deputy Speaker, and that the law would enable this, to actually deceive the public, to lie to the public through a government-funded entity to try and stop a project on not dubious ground, on deceptive grounds, which harm both the Indigenous communities and, of course, the economic progress of this nation. So I think that one case alone has demonstrated the EPBC Act needs some pretty significant reform. But it has to be done from a position of integrity and trust and balance. Now, it is simply impossible for any member at this point, with the way the government is trying to bully and ram this legislation through this parliament, to have actually gone through it and actually done the proper work necessary to pass it. We can have our debates about what should be included or not included. I fully respect the fact there will be a diversity of views across the crossbenchers, the members of the government, of course, the opposition. But when they essentially tabled only last week, we've now got 1,500 pages of legislation with the explanatory memorandum. How on earth is anybody supposed to understand what the practical consequences are for small businesses, the flow-on consequences for large projects? For mining, I see the member to my left and the impact it's going to have on farmers and her community. How is she supposed to be able to have that conversation and do the proper consultation? And this is what this parliament is being asked to vote on. And meanwhile, we've actually got a process in the Senate which is designed to actually review the laws and give people, the Australian people, you know them, the people we're supposed to be representing, some input into the process, for them to highlight some of the deficiencies in these laws, which is actually quite important. I heard the member for Moore before, celebrating the legislation, saying how important it was and how we're just going to smash it through, but seems completely indifferent to the fact that we actually need to have a conversation with the Australian people about the consequences, because no matter how arrogant a government may be at any given time, every government makes mistakes in legislative drafting, in unintended consequences, where they design laws which have a flow-on effect that was not fully appreciated. I don't think for 1 second that when the original Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act was designed, anybody thought, I know what's going to happen. The Environmental Defender's Office, which the current Albanese government funds, is going to use that act to then go and take action against a gas project using a dishonest, deceptive and lying campaign on the basis of a mythical, invented Aboriginal songlines campaign, and use to take that all the way up to the federal court. I don't think anybody thought that, Deputy Speaker. It's kind of why you've got to review legislation and go through the proper process. So there'll be a record about how everybody voted on this bill. But make no mistake, Deputy Speaker, to vote for 1,500 pieces of legislation, which I am willing to bet to a T for every single member on the government benches, they have not read, and they certainly haven't consulted their communities, and they certainly don't understand the consequences outside of the 3-page talking points, no doubt issued by the whip. There has to be a sobriety with this legislation and what it is we need to do. So when the Albanese government continues to treat this House of Representatives and this parliament like the National People's Congress and thinks that we're all just a bunch of applauding eunuchs rather than standing up, speaking out, scrutinising legislation, asking questions, challenging legislation, debating it, we know we've got a problem. How about we have this Senate inquiry? How about we have input from the Australian people? How about we have input from groups like the Business Council, as some members have raised? How about we have input from farmers' groups? How about we have input from industry associations? How about we have input from environmental groups too? Because well-designed laws will, of course, involve consultation. Just because people have input doesn't mean guaranteed we have to listen to it, but it does mean, or included I should say more correctly, but people should be able to have a say into their democracy. So how about we have a bit of input in the process? But we haven't seen that. Instead, what we've seen is just a bullying approach by this government towards this House of Representatives. Well, some of us aren't trained Unix, Deputy Speaker. Some of us aren't just going to applaud the Prime Minister along. Some of us are going to stand up and speak out about it, because there are important issues that are on the table, from looking at the ministerial discretion that the minister wants in this legislation, and it's pretty wide ministerial discretion, which is raising concerns across the chamber about what the minister will be empowered to do and what the minister will not be empowered to do. The capacity for this whole process to duplicate what happens in state as well as federal regulation. So instead of streamlining and speeding up the process of environmental regulation, it could actually have the reverse effect, where it actually increases the burden, the costs, the compliance. And remember, this isn't for some sort of mystical benefit, except for people whose sole purpose to be paid to process paperwork. And then, of course, there are other important issues like the extent of offset arrangements that have been established under the legislation to make sure that we conserve the environment, but in a way that encourages and incentivises project development, because in the end that's what we should actually want as a country. It doesn't really matter how we design the law. We have to make sure that we're stewarding the environment to a better future, but it also has to be through a pathway of acknowledging that we have to manage our challenges for the environment as well. And so those groups haven't had their say. So far they're saying this legislation's a dud. They're saying it's a dud because it actually makes the problems worse, and stakeholders who have the chance to be able to speak up in the public square are calling out the Albanese government for their ramrod approach. The question is why members of the government feel so fixated and obsessed with wanting to override rational conversation in this legislation. I understand, and you can see it again going back to question time, where all of the ministers get up and praise their Prime Minister. He's obviously got a dirt file that has something on all of them, because there's no other basis that anybody would get up and be so sycophantic. And when it comes down to it, the reality is ministers and particularly backbenchers have a responsibility to ask basic questions of ministers and, of course, of the legislation they put forward. So my recommendation to the minister is fix the laws, listen to the public, take input and views, and actually allow the time, the reasonable proportionate amount of time, for 1,500 pages of legislation and explanatory memorandum to be properly considered. Because if you don't, and if the minister gets this wrong, the consequences for the environment could be profound. The consequences for economic development for Australia could be profound. The consequences for Indigenous communities could be profound. But at the moment, all those calls are falling on deaf ears, which is another emblematic example of the arrogance of the Albanese government and how it is slowly manifesting up since about the 3rd of May, where you see the Prime Minister fly in as obliged if he occasionally has to appear before the Parliament to answer to at least the people who are elected by the Australian people, and he does it certainly very dismissively, and particularly when it's not on topics he likes. And more importantly, he gets up with his boastfulness and arrogance and throws barbs and sharp lines, which I've no doubt probably makes him feel chipper and good in the process, but isn't necessarily improving the governance of this nation. So we all face choices. The choice before the Parliament right now is, do we pass this legislation, or do we review it and improve it? Do we make sure that we get the balance right? Do we make sure that we create the legislation this country so desperately needs, so that environmental regulation can steward the environment, empower the economy and, of course, propel it forward to the future? Or do we continue to accept the arrogance and indulgence of this government and vote for legislation, ram it through without any concern or consequence of its impact, which could very much lead to disastrous consequences for the people of Australia.
The question